Happy Tuesday, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar. Before I introduce our presenter, I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping announcements. The Mountain Plains Prevention Technology Transfer Center at the University of Utah is excited to welcome you to the last of our 6-part webinar series, Informing Prevention, with an emphasis on adolescents. A recording of this webinar, as well as slides in a PDF format, will be available on our website, which you'll see listed there on the slide. It's pttcnetwork.org/mountainplains. You'll find those next week. It takes us a couple days. For those of you interested in a certificate following today's webinar, please email mountainplains_pttc@utah.edu. We are now an approved NAIADAC provider. For all other licensure and credentials, you may use your certificate and apply directly to your board. All participants will be muted today, so we encourage you to use the chat feature for questions and messages. Following today's webinar, we would really appreciate it if you would complete our GIPRA survey. You will see a link to the GIPRA survey posted in the chat feature. You can see it now, and we'll also post it again at the end of the webinar. It's really important that our participants provide us with their feedback to help us improve our training. And it's also something that our funder, SAMHSA, highly encourages. So if you could please take a moment after the webinar to complete that, that would be great. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. For those of you who have participated in our previous webinars, you'll get the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Jason Burrow-Sanchez again today. Dr. Burrow-Sanchez is a professor of counseling psychology in the Department of Educational Psychology here at the University of Utah. He is also the director of the Mountain Plains Region 8 Prevention Technology Transfer Center, which is funded by SAMHSA. His research interests include the prevention and treatment of substance use for adolescents in school and community settings. His research has been funded at the local, state, and national levels, and he has published numerous articles, chapters, and books. He is also a licensed psychologist in the state of Utah. So I'm going to now turn the time over to Jason.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. The topic of our webinar today is vaping among adolescents, what we know and what we don't. We have about an hour to spend together. So thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to do that. And I'm going to go through a series of slides that I have and give you some information. And then I'll leave some time at the end to ask questions if what I cover doesn't answer any questions that you have, or you have any follow-ups to things that I do cover. So one of the things that I like to do when I do webinars and presentations in general is kind of focus them around key questions. And many times I'm asked, because of this is one of my interest areas, substance use in general, especially with adolescents and youth, is what are some of the things around substances, and today's particular topic is vaping. So what are some of the key questions that we want to concern ourselves with, at least within the context of this webinar, to give us some focus, because we won't be able to cover everything, but we're going to cover what we have here. So one of the first key questions is that I get asked a lot: what are the rates of vaping among adolescents? So what is the prevalence like? How often does that occur? And especially compared to other substances as well. Another question that I typically get asked is, why do adolescents vape? In addition to why do adolescents use substances and so forth. So even though we're going to be talking about vaping today, I also want you to kind of broaden or generalize this notion or idea to also consider, why do adolescents use substances in general? And then another question is, what are the social and biological factors related to vaping? So what are some of them? We're not going to have time to cover all of them, but what are some of the things we should know about? And in particular to that, what are some of the things that will help us or inform us around prevention practices? So what do we know socially and biologically around vaping or around substance use that kind of help what we do about it? And so these are the four key questions that I want to kind of present to you initially, and will help guide us as we move forward in terms of this webinar. The other thing is, before we kind of get into these questions specifically, I wanted to just give you some background information on some prevention frameworks. So this webinar is based on informing prevention. So what are some of the common prevention frameworks out there? And the reason I'm gonna point some of these out in the next few slides is because some of you will have some familiarity with some, maybe not with some others, and really to show you how prevention frameworks are probably more similar than different, per se. So one of them that you may be familiar with is SAMHSA Strategic Prevention Framework, which is like it says, it's a framework in a way how you approach things from a prevention standpoint in terms of, as you can see here through the diagram, assessment, capacity, planning, implementation, and evaluation. So fairly comprehensive. And some of you, again, may be familiar with this, some of you may not. Another prevention framework that you may or may not be familiar with, but my guess is some of you are, is the Institute of Medicine Continuum of Care, which places prevention on a continuum, as you can see here, in terms of universal, selective, or indicated, and also follows it along with treatment and maintenance. Okay, and I could probably give you whole webinars on why this is set up this way and so on and so forth. But that's not really the point of today. Really, the point of these slides is to show you that there's different prevention frameworks out there, and they're probably more similar than different. Another prevention framework, especially if you work in school settings that you might be familiar with, is the triangle. And the triangle actually comes from the Institute of Medicine model. And the triangle focuses on primary prevention or universal prevention, secondary prevention or selective prevention, and tertiary prevention or indicated prevention. Now, personally, I tend to like this one a lot, in part because it's easy for me to understand and pretty straightforward. And what it's really indicating is that, let's say this triangle is an entire school of youth or adolescents that we're working with, that if we deliver a primary prevention strategy, so a primary prevention strategy may be to address substance use, and a primary prevention strategy would be something that all adolescents get in the school, so they may get in their health class or what have you. And what it's really suggesting here is that about 80%, or the green part of the triangle, are going to respond to that primary prevention, okay? But what it's also suggesting is there's about 20% of the triangle here that are going to need more intensive intervention or prevention services. So, and roughly there's about this middle part of the triangle, or this yellow part of the triangle, is about 15%, top part of the triangle is about 5%. And so what it's suggesting is that it's secondary level prevention or selective prevention, which is kind of small groups or small targeted group-based prevention. You're going to have about 15% of youth who are not going to respond to the green part, but are going to need more intensive services. And then you're going to have about 5% of youth who are going to need even more intensive services than that. Now, I'm not going to belabor this point too much, but what I really just wanted to point out is that there's different levels of prevention, and this will come into play more as we talk about how do we address prevention issues in terms of substance abuse and vaping. Because one of the questions that I'll have for you is you need to consider, depending on the settings that you're working in, at what level of prevention are you trying to intervene? Because that will actually help you determine what are some of the things you should do about your prevention strategies. Okay. Another slide I just wanted to present before we kind of get into the key questions is a brief e-cigarette history. And I want to tell you that I'm going to use the terms e-cigarette and vaping synonymously or interchangeably for this webinar, and that'll probably become more clear in a few slides, but a brief history. So in 2007, e-cigarettes were introduced into the US. They had been introduced into other countries before, but roughly the literature kind of suggests that around 2007, e-cigarettes were first kind of largely introduced in the US. So not a long time ago. In 2014, from our survey data, and I'm going to show you some survey data in a bit, it really became real clear from survey data, both from household survey data and school-based survey data, that e-cigarettes was the most commonly used tobacco product for youth, surpassed cigarettes by far, and that continues to today. So in terms of the most commonly used tobacco product by youth, it's e-cigarettes by far. It's not regular cigarettes. And another synonym I'm going to use for regular cigarettes is combustible cigarettes, and that just means essentially you light them on fire or they combust. So that's how people also describe regular cigarettes. In 2016, the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, had a deeming rule, and what this rule really did is extended the regulations for other tobacco-based products, which included e-cigarettes, and started to say, well, the FDA can start to regulate these things as well. Now, it's debatable in terms of what the FDA really does in terms of regulate e-cigarettes. They're not regulated anywhere near that regular or combustible cigarettes are. We've had a lot more time, decades of research and work to regulate regular cigarettes, and e-cigarettes are kind of the new kids on the block. So we're still trying to figure out how to regulate those things and what that looks like. And I could probably give you a whole nother webinar on what that looks like as well. 2017, Juul, which you probably heard if you know anything or have referenced e-cigarettes, Juul, the Juul brand becomes the most popular brand on the market. And they split off from another company around 2015, 16. But around 2017, they really took the market over. And so if you work with youth and you hear the word Juul, Juul is actually referring to a market, it's a brand, okay? So sometimes this gets used as a verb, because sometimes youth will say, well, I'm Juuling, but really what they're indicating is it's a brand. So it's kind of like Kleenex, right? Kleenex refers to a tissue, but a lot of people use it synonymously with the actual product itself. Okay, and lastly here quickly, in 2018, Juul took over. They became the most popular brand in 2017. That's why you hear about them. 2018, Juul by far has 70% of the market share in e-cigarettes. E-cigarettes is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Juul is one of the huge leaders in that industry. And if you keep up with kind of the news articles and so forth, the regular tobacco companies have actually bought stock in Juul because they know they're so profitable, and they also have less regulations currently. Okay, so that's just a brief e-cigarette history. I could probably do, again, a whole other lecture on all these things, but just to give you some background. The other thing I wanted to point out was just some vaping basics, so we can have some ideas, or we can kind of be on the same page when we talk about what does vaping mean, what does it look like, and so forth. And so vaping really is, for me anyway, the way I understand it is from this equation. You need an electronic device, you need a liquid, and basically that will equal a vape. So what do we mean by that? So basically you need an electronic device. And down here in this diagram or this picture, you have many different types of electronic devices, and there's a lot of them out there. There isn't just one kind, okay? There's a lot of them out there. If you happen to work with youth and in schools, a popular one right now is the one I have my cursor on that kind of looks like a USB drive. But there's a lot of other things out there, and they're changing all the time, is one thing you need to know about that. Well, one of the things we also know is that in addition to the electronic device, you need a liquid, right? So you need a liquid to go with the electronic device. And if you consider these are called pods sometimes. The paraphernalia is called different things, but these little pods basically, in terms of a liquid, they can contain as much nicotine as a pack of cigarettes, okay? So there could be a lot of nicotine contained in these little pods. And what the electronic device does, basically, it gives it these pods a receptacle, but it also provides a heating element. And what the heating element does is heats the liquid. And the liquid can contain flavoring, it could contain nicotine, sometimes it could contain THC, and THC is the active ingredient in marijuana, because there's been a lot more youth vaping marijuana as well. And what that does, so what that equals when those things happen, is it produces an aerosol, or a vapor, as more commonly known. And the aerosol gets released into the air, the aerosol gets released into your lungs when you're breathing it in, and so forth. And here's some of the catches with this, because a lot of times you think, well, this aerosol that gets released is just a harmless water vapor, and it's really not. The aerosol is composed of all the chemicals that go into the liquid. And the other thing that is the electronic devices, as they become more sophisticated, you can actually heat the liquid to different degrees. So some of the unknowns that we don't really know about is at what temperature, right, that things are being produced in the aerosol in relation to the liquid, which it can produce different types of particulates in the aerosols. And also, we don't always know what's in the liquid, because again, what I said is it's not regulated as well as regular cigarettes are at this point. So what we know from regular cigarettes, just to give you a comparison, is when you smoke a regular cigarette or a combustible cigarette, there's about 7,000 chemicals released, if you can believe that. And we've had decades to research this, and we know that at least 70 of those things are known carcinogens. What we don't know from vaping is we don't know what the aerosol and the chemicals in the aerosol will do to us long term. We just don't have that research. And so one of the misconceptions is about it is that it's safe, it won't do any harm to us, which is just not true. We just don't have that information yet, which likely the next decade or so we'll have more of that information. But what we do know is that the aerosol that's released in the e-cigarettes contains particulates, contains volatile organic compounds, it contains heavy metals and other cancer-causing chemicals. We just don't know what the long-term effects are, okay? So I just wanted to point that out, but just to give you also some vaping basics in terms of what are some of the devices and what are some of the liquids. Okay, so we're gonna turn to our kind of our first key question for the webinar and ask, so what are the rates of adolescent vaping? And I'm going to start with this graph because I want to show this in the context of adolescent vaping in relation to other substances that adolescents use. Well, it turns out, so this is data from, this is school-based data from the Monitoring the Future survey, which is done on an annual basis. And it's 30 days and it's 12th grade. So basically they asked 12th graders in the past 30 days, how often have you used these substances? And the idea is that someone who's used in the past 30 days would be considered a current user based on kind of survey research, survey methodology. And what they found is that in the past 30 days, about 30% of 12th graders have used alcohol, about 22% have used marijuana, about 16% have used e-cigarettes, and about 9% have used regular cigarettes. So a couple things we can notice is that e-cigarettes are not the most commonly used. They're in the top 3, absolutely, of the most commonly used. But also e-cigarettes has surpassed regular cigarettes in terms of use. In the past 2 decades, we've actually seen declines in regular cigarette use by youth, and that's actually changed within the past 5 years in terms of the survey data, because we've actually seen increases that have surpassed and going on almost doubling, not quite, regular cigarette use. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that opiates, you hear a lot about in the news media and so forth, but by far, if we ask 12th graders the amount of opiates that they're using, it's less than 2%. By and large, the most popular drugs that are used are alcohol, marijuana, and cigarettes, whether it be e-cigarettes or regular cigarettes. Opiates are not used anywhere near these other substances, especially for youth. And I just wanted to point that out. Now, if we kind of look even deeper into this and ask about, well, in 12th grade now, because we looked at some 12th grade data, what does it look like in terms of alcohol use, marijuana use, vaping, and cigarettes in relation to lifetime and 30-day? So for 12th graders, if we look at the alcohol use level, we have about, at the end of 12th grade, we have about 60% of youth saying, have you ever used alcohol in your lifetime? About 60% of youth will say, yeah. So more than half the youth in 12th grade will say, I've used alcohol. What we also find out is remember what I said before about the 30-day use in terms of current users, about half that will say that their current users or used it in the last 30 days. Marijuana, we find out about 40, or a little more than 40% have used marijuana, and again, about half that would be considered current users. Vaping, about 42%, very similar to marijuana, and actually the rates of current users in vaping is higher than what it is in marijuana. The other thing you need to consider is that many times now you find that vaping is used to vape marijuana. And then what I talked about before is in terms of traditional cigarettes or combustible cigarettes, about 20% of youth say that I've ever tried these cigarettes, and about 7%, roughly 8% of youth say that I've used it in the past 30 days, and so forth. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to show you to kind of, again, take a little bit deeper dive is to look into 12th grade again, but also show you what the vaping, in terms of vaping estimates look like. So when we ask 12th graders, how often have they ever vaped in their lifetime, or how many have vaped in their lifetime, about 40%, 42% say, you know, I've vaped before. And what we can consider lifetime use is just experimental use. I've tried it. And then if we go to the 30-day numbers and we consider, well, how many youth have used in the past 30 days or current users, we find about 26%. So similar to what we just saw in the prior slide. But now we ask, what about vaping nicotine? When we break it down and say, what are you vaping? Are you just vaping nicotine? Are you just vaping flavoring? Or are you vaping marijuana? About 34%, you know, I've ever tried vaping nicotine. About 20% say that I actually kind of do it on a regular basis. Again, if we asked, are you just vaping the flavoring? About 34% say, yes, I've done that, very similar to nicotine. And about the less, 13% say, yeah, I'm vaping the flavoring. Why that's important is because these things are marketed in a number of different flavors. And I'm going to show you some of that in a bit in another slide. But flavoring tends to be one of the reasons that adolescents say that they actually try vaping, because they come in a number, literally hundreds of different flavors that seem to be very attractive to adolescents. The other reason that that's important is we have studies, we have research that's also shown that even when adolescents think they're buying just flavoring with no nicotine in it, we found that these products sometimes will contain nicotine. Again, it goes back to how well are they regulated. They're not regulated very well. So even though a product just says it contains flavoring, it may contain flavoring and nicotine, even though the adolescent isn't aware of that. The other thing is vaping marijuana. There's also a subset of adolescents that will vape marijuana with these products as well. You can also buy vaporizers for dry leaf marijuana, and you can also buy THC infused oils to vape as well. Okay, so that gives you some estimates in terms of how often it's used. It's one of the top 3 things used by adolescents. I'd like to point this out because I think this infographic helps bring it home. And this is from the CDC infographic, or Center for Disease Control. And you may have seen this if you've researched vaping at all, but what it really shows that there's been an increase. And from 2017 to 18, there's been a 78% increase among high school students around in vaping. There's been a 48% increase among middle school students in vaping. So what does that really mean? So if you're in high school and you're in a class of 25, so if some of you work in high schools or you have an adolescence, I have 2 daughters who are adolescents currently. So if they're in a class of 25 students, it means that on average about 5 students in that class will likely be vaping, okay? So what does that mean for middle school? In a class of 25, on average about a little more than 1 adolescent will vape. And what we see here is we go from middle school to high school, the numbers increase, right? So we go from 1.25 to 5. So it increases across time. So I think the take-home point here is it's something that's increased very recently, more recently, the past 5 years or so, something we need to be aware of and likely concerned about. Okay, so the other key question, the second key question that I wanted to point out was, what are some of the reasons why youth vape? And so this graph actually is from a study that was done in 2018. And this asked them, it just basically asked adolescents, what are some of the reasons why you vape? Well, most adolescents, right? So what this is suggesting here is that adolescents say, well, vapes are easier to get than regular cigarettes. Most adolescents really don't think that's the case. And in reality, it means here that 5% of middle school students and 4.5% of high school students think that vapes are easier to get. So basically what it means is that 95% think it's really not that hard to get. And that's the truth. Cigarettes and vaping paraphernalia and liquids are not hard to get at all. Especially with vaping, a lot of the sales are done over the internet. And if you've ever tried to buy a vape over the internet, all you have to do is go on, regardless of what the legal age is to buy vape, and that depends on the state that you're in. It can run anywhere from 18 to 21. For regular cigarettes as well, you just have to click the box and you just have to say, yes, I'm 18 or I'm 21 or whatever the age is in that state. Another thing they asked them, do you think vaping or e-cigarettes are less harmful than regular cigarettes? Well, a proportion of about 16% of middle schoolers and about 70% of high schoolers say, yeah, I think they are less harmful. Okay, so there is some perception that they are less harmful, even though what I said before is we don't know some of the long-term effects of what they do. And the other thing is, some of the reason that adolescents may be saying this is because they also think they're just vaping flavoring, where in fact they may also be vaping nicotine. But what we know just from the flavoring itself is it also produces some of the it also produces chemicals and the aerosol, as I was talking about before, that have been known linked to toxins and carcinogens. We just don't know what some of the long-term effects are. We probably will know in the next decade or so. But let's focus on the last 2 reasons why, when we ask adolescents, about 26% and about 32% respectively in middle and high school say that the flavors are the reasons that they vape. So one of the things we know from a prevention standpoint is flavors are really important to adolescents. And if you read the news media and so forth, and one of the things you hear the FDA going back and forth with the vaping companies is the flavors that are out there. And one of the reasons that the flavors become so important is because flavoring is very attractive to adolescents. You know, they come in anywhere from bubblegum to cotton candy and so on and so forth. And the vaping companies say, you know, we don't target adolescents. But that becomes really questionable when a lot of their flavoring really looks like things that adolescents would find very attractive. And the last reason here is when we ask adolescents the reasons for vaping, you can see that 43% and 37% say it's because a friend or a peer or a family member also vapes. That's the reason I vape. So not unlike other substances, because we know when adolescents start using or youth start using substances, one of the first ways that they start using substances or they become introduced to it is because someone close to them is also using the substance. Okay. So we're gonna jump now to social factors. So kind of our question 3, what are some of the social factors related to adolescent vaping and so forth? And some of these are gonna apply not just to vaping, but also to substance use in general. One of the things we know is that substance use typically starts in adolescence, okay? So if we work with adults clinically and we ask adults generally if they have a substance use disorder or a pretty severe substance use issue, we ask them, when did you start using substances? By and large, they started using substances when they were youth. And generally, those with the more severe issues started using at earlier ages. One of the first substances they started using typically is cigarettes. And likely now, the trend we'll start to see now, it'll be e-cigarettes. So one of the things we know from prevention work and our survey work and so forth is that substance use typically starts in adolescence. It doesn't typically start in adulthood on average, okay? Another factor we know is, like I said before, is that tobacco products are one of the first substances that tend to be used by adolescents. So it tends to be tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana in that order. And lo and behold, it's one of the top 3 things that we see that adolescents use. That becomes important because we know from our survey data, we know from longitudinal data, we know from correlational data that early use of tobacco-based products, cigarettes or e-cigarettes, is unfortunately, it's a good predictor of later use of substances, and not just tobacco-based products, but substances across the board. So that's another thing we tend to know as well. And here's another factor, here's a factoid for you, I guess, is that most adults who smoke cigarettes, or actually I'm going to give you a number, 90% of adults, one of the things we know from the research is 90% of adults who smoke cigarettes started using before they were age 18. Okay, so again, just to reinforce the idea that most people start using these products before they turn 18. As I said before, another social factor is use of substances at younger ages predicts use at later ages. So as you can kind of see, I'm setting a bit of a pattern here to kind of illustrate that prevention is important, right? So if we can get youth to prevent them from using substances in the first place or to delay the onset of use, that really can help us reduce the opportunity for them to use in the future. And the last thing I wanted to point out is because one of the other things, especially with vaping, that gets brought up, well, isn't vaping safer, right? Wouldn't I want a youth to vape as opposed to use e-cig, or as opposed to using regular cigarettes and so forth? Well, the data that's starting to show up now, the research that's starting to show up now, it looks like that even with youth who begin their tobacco-based product exposure with e-cigarettes are at a lot higher likelihood of actually using regular cigarettes in the future. So they're not at a less likelihood from using regular cigarettes, they're actually at a higher likelihood. So it doesn't mean that using e-cigarettes is going to protect them from using regular cigarettes. And we have decades of research to know what some of the outcomes of regular cigarette use is. Okay. So just to give you some ideas, again, some of the social factors, but I don't want to not also give you some ideas of what some of the biological factors are. And so some of the great thing about the brain research over the past few decades is it gives us more information about how the brain operates, how the brain develops across time, and what it looks like. One of the things we know from substances that are used, and this is not just nicotine, but substances in general, is that when people use substances, one of the things it activates is what's called a reward pathway in the brain. And the VTA, or this part down here, the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, are parts of the brain, or let's say the middle part of the brain, that really become activated and developed during adolescence. As where the prefrontal cortex, as we know from the brain research, is still developing into a person's mid-20s and so forth. Well, the reasons this nucleus accumbens and VTA, and I'm not so worried that you remember these names, but what I'm just trying to show you is this concept. The reason that that's so important and they become activated is because things like emotion and how adolescents respond, and sensation seeking and motivation really come online during adolescence. And one of the things, so that's the kind of the green part, the developmental part of the brain. One of the things that takes a little longer to develop is this prefrontal cortex. So what we know from this reward pathway is that when adolescents take, or when anyone takes substances, it increases one of the neurotransmitters in the brain called dopamine. So, and dopamine is important because anytime dopamine is increased in the brain says, do this more. So naturally we get increases in dopamine from things like eating, drinking, sex, nurturing, kind of all the basic things. Well, also we can mimic increases in dopamine by using substances, including nicotine, alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, take your pick. They all kind of operate in similar ways. Well, that can become problematic sometimes because if this middle part of the brain becomes more fully developed during adolescence, but this front part of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, which is really important because that helps us make decisions, engage in planful problem solving and so forth, is still developing during this time. Some of the theories suggest that this middle part of the brain kind of overrides that because of the increases in dopamine. Okay, so what does that mean for us specifically in relation to nicotine? So here's another view of the brain, same reward pathway, but on this time, basically what I'm showing you now is where these specific drugs interact with the reward pathway and increase the levels of dopamine. So what we do know specifically with nicotine, and again, here's our green section, which is the middle section of the brain, and our top section, which is the prefrontal cortex. What we do know with nicotine, and a lot of this research comes from the preclinical studies or animal studies, is we do know that adolescent brains, compared to adult brains, tend to be more sensitive to the rewarding effects of nicotine, okay? So adolescent brains tend to be very primed to the effects of nicotine. So unfortunately, what I'm trying to say here is that adolescence is a good time to introduce nicotine if you're a marketeer, because it's a high likelihood that the adolescent brain is going to be very susceptible to it. Also, we know that nicotine withdrawal tends to be more blunted compared to the adult brain. The adolescent brain, rather, tends, in terms of nicotine withdrawal, when nicotine is withdrawn, tends to be more blunted in the adolescent brain compared to the adult brain. So what does that mean for us as well? Well, one of the things we know, and what I was trying to show you here, is that anytime we introduce a substance like nicotine, cocaine, heroin, and nicotine, those are all stimulants here, or alcohol and heroin, and some substances may interact in different places in the reward pathway. We increase in the levels of dopamine. And what that means is, and unfortunately what happens is it increases the level of dopamine beyond what would be typical in our brain. Well, the problem with that is once we start to decrease the use of that substance, so let's say cigarettes in this point, or e-cigarettes, it decreases the level of dopamine beyond which would be normal. So the problem with that is that when we increase something and then take it away, what it produces is withdrawal symptoms. So initially, adolescents may start using e-cigarettes or cigarettes in part because they're introduced to cigarettes or e-cigarettes from someone else, like a peer or a family member. They like the flavorings, but they may become, quote, addicted to them because after using them from a time, they actually alter the brain chemistry in terms of increasing the levels of dopamine, but they're not. But when they take it away, the brain's saying, I want more, I want more. And essentially what the brain is doing is it's telling the body to have these withdrawal symptoms. And that's what the adolescent in part is experiencing in every time they take a hit off the e-cigarette or the regular cigarette, is they're reducing the withdrawal symptoms. So what happens is, to kind of make this a long story short, is what happens is adolescents can get introduced to things socially, but they continue to use things or, quote, become addicted to things biologically. The other thing we know is that higher doses of nicotine are better tolerated by, and this again comes from some of our animal studies, is better tolerated by adolescent brains than adult brains. And where that becomes important is because one of the things that e-cigarettes do is they make the nicotine, they make it a more pleasurable experience than regular combustible cigarettes. So what does that mean? So let me back up here a little bit. So with regular combustible cigarettes, it contains what's called a free-base nicotine. With e-cigarettes, what happens is the chemical structures change a little bit, and they take an acid and they combine it with the nicotine. And what that does essentially just is it reduces the level of pH, or reduces the pH balance. And what it produces is called a nicotine salt. So that's actually generally what's contained in the liquid in terms of the e-cigarettes. So what that does kind of clinically or functionally for the adolescent or for the person using it is it makes the experience of using the e-cigarette more pleasurable or less irritating than a regular cigarette is. So remember what I told you about before, some of the pods contain up to the same amount of nicotine that a pack of cigarettes does. Well, one of the things that they've done by changing some of the chemical composition in relation to the liquids produced or put into the e-cigarettes is they've made the experience more pleasurable and in addition, they've also increases the levels of concentration of the nicotine as well. And one of the last thing I just want to point out is that in terms of nicotine compared to an adolescent and adult brain, it also, what we tend to find is also enhances the acquisition of other substances. So what it means is that by using, what we think is that by using nicotine earlier, it also makes it more likely that the brain is going to respond to other substances like marijuana, like alcohol, and it's going to be easier to kind of receive those signals and more rewarding to receive those signals. And clinically, what we tend to find is that probably one of the first reasons why adolescents start using tobacco-based products and later move on to other products. Okay, so the last thing, or the last question that I'm going to focus on is kind of how do we prevent adolescents from vaping? Now that we've talked about what are some of the rates of vaping, what are some of the social and biological factors, you know, what does kind of the constellation of vaping look like in terms of the products and so on. And rather than give you specific vaping or vaping protocols or vaping programs, what I'm really going to focus you on are what are some of the principles of prevention that we know and how would you address them. The reason I'm going to do that is because what I said before is you really want to consider initially what level of prevention are you working at? Are you working at the universal prevention? Are you working at the secondary prevention? Are you working at the tertiary prevention level? Because your intervention strategies will be a little bit different depending on which level you're working at. So one of the things we know from kind of prevention strategies, prevention research, is that probably it's really important to prevent youth from using the substance in the first place. So when we ask the question, have you ever used a substance? What we're really asking is, you know, we want to prevent you from using that in the first place. And how do we go about doing that? We'll talk about in a sec. But the other thing that I want to get across in terms of a prevention principle, it's also really important to prevent the delay of onset of a substance. So we know that if we can prevent youth from using a substance in the first place, that's probably a pretty good thing because we know that most substance use starts to occur during youth, so we can prevent it from occurring in the first place. But also if we can delay the onset of use. So remember what I talked about before, the earlier that a youth uses substances tends to predict later use. So if we can delay that onset till the youth is later, it actually decreases the risk that they're going to have a substance use disorder or a substance use problem later on. And the third thing is we want to prevent the use of substances from becoming more severe. So even if we have youth who use substances, right, we didn't prevent it from the first place or we didn't delay the onset, we also want to think about if a youth is using, how do we prevent the use, how do we prevent it from becoming more severe so they don't end up in the red part of the triangle, but maybe we try to push them back down to the green part of the triangle, or maybe they're in the yellow part of the triangle. So that's why I'm saying it really depends on what area of prevention, what level of prevention you're really working on. Well, some of the things I want you to consider within that in terms of how do we go about doing that is perceived risk and substance use. So one of the things we talk about in the prevention literature is what is the perceived risk of using a substance? Well, it turns out that if adolescents perceive a substance to be more risky to use, they're less likely to use it. So remember what I said before around the differences between regular cigarettes or combustible cigarettes and e-cigarettes. Right now, what we know from the survey literature is that adolescents perceive regular cigarettes to be more risky to use. They're less likely to use them than they are e-cigarettes, in part because there's some misperceptions about what e-cigarettes are, and the fact that we don't have the data yet, the longer term data that shows what can be potentially some of the more of the harmful outcomes of using e-cigarettes. But we know if we equip adolescents with good information around what some of these effects are, and they perceive it to be more risky, they're going to use it less. The other thing we know from the prevention literature is that the disapproval of using a substance is very strong. So if adolescents hang around peers, or they have parents who disapprove of using a substance, that will also influence their behavior. Okay, so if their peers don't use substances, they're less likely to use substances. If their peers use substances, they're more likely to use substances. We know that from the correlational literature. And the reasons why I'm pointing these things out, because both these things relate to the use of a substance. So as perceived risk increases, use of substance decreases. As disapproval increases, use of substance decreases. So two of the things that we should really be concerned with in terms of these kind of prevention strategies, prevention principles, is informing the adolescents about the perceived risk of using a substance, and also informing their peers and the folks they're associated with, their parents, about using a substance. So I've been in schools and spoken with parents, and a lot of times, unfortunately, parents just don't have a lot of information about the risks or potentially harmful effects of e-cigarettes and what they mean for adolescents. Okay, so the other thing, what I said in terms of preventing adolescents vaping behavior, or just kind of preventing adolescent substance use in general, is I want you to consider what are some prevention principles and also intervention principles. So what are some of the things we know? Well, one of the things we know is prevention is important. If you can prevent it from occurring in the first place, it's much easier to deal with than after a person has started using any substance, regardless of what that substance is. Or if you can prevent the delay of onset, right? You can increase the amount of time that it takes them to use the substance, so they don't start using until they're 18 as opposed to using when they're 15. We know that the risk also decreases as well. Okay, so that's just kind of one of the principles that we know. Another one that we know about, from what we know about some of the social factors and some of the biological factors that I just talked about, and from some of our prevention principles, is the teaching adolescents about changes in the body and brain. And we know that there's developmental growth periods, and we know that there's specific effects of substances on the brain and body. So one of the things we probably don't do as much is teach adolescents what these things look like. We tend to focus more on what are some of the negative effects, as opposed to also teaching adolescents, why do people use these substances? What are the changes that they make into the brain and the body? But also, what are some of the effects that they can have? So balancing out some of the negative effects of using these substances, in addition to what are reasons why people use these things. And it could be different reasons why people use these things. They may get introduced to them from a peer or from a family member, right? But then over time, they actually are changing or influencing their brain chemistry to the point it's really hard to stop using them. And we know that cigarette use, we have decades of research to suggest that cigarette use is one of the things that's difficult to stop. Another one is also teaching emotional regulation, in terms of teaching adolescents things about anger, anxiety, and negative moods. Sometimes this may be referred to as kind of social emotional learning. But if we look at the brain research and what we know about the brain research and what I suggested before, and I've done other webinars on kind of the development of the brain and so forth. I didn't have a lot of time to spend here, but go back and look at some of our other webinars. And what we know is that the middle part of the brain, which is involved in things like emotion regulation and so forth, which really comes online around puberty and adolescence and so forth, tend to really become, as I said before, tends to become developed during adolescence, but that prefrontal cortex, or that top part of the brain, takes a while, takes more time to develop. So one of the things that adolescents may be struggling with, like some of them may be struggling with, is anxiety, anger, negative moods, and maybe some of the factors that are related to using substances. They may be, quote, self-medicating with some of these substances. So there is no harm in teaching adolescents about emotional regulation and teaching them ways to do that that can be more beneficial to them as opposed to using substances. Another one is also, if we think about the prefrontal cortex, right, and it's not fully developed until a person's mid-20s or so, even though I want to point out there's individual variation in that. So you can find 15-year-olds who make better decisions than 25-year-olds and vice versa. But by and large, kind of what we know from the brain research, there's no problem in teaching adolescents about problem solving, explicitly teaching them problem solving, decision-making skills, helping them influence, right, helping them increase the growth in their prefrontal cortex in terms of things like understanding consequences, choices, and planning of behavior, all right? And the last thing I want to say is also teaching adolescents the influence of contextual pressure, peer pressure, social media, advertising, especially with vaping. I don't know if you've been online lately, but I talked about before, where do you get these products? A lot of time they're received over the internet. In the old days, in terms of with cigarettes, it used to be it used to be on television and the radio, you know, but adolescents, that's not the way adolescents receive any information anymore. It's really around social media and their phones and so forth and on the internet. And go online, and if you don't believe me, just look for yourself and look at all the ads and the money that vaping manufacturers spend on targeting people to use their products. And the pressure, and as I said before, a lot of this, one of the most common reasons why adolescents use vaping products is because someone else around them has used it in terms of a peer or a family member. So there's no problem in teaching adolescents the contextual influence and the pressure around either peer use, social media, and advertising, and so forth. So what am I trying to tell you here? And by showing you these prevention principles, is that because people will ask me, so what interventions should I use? You know, what's the best thing out there? Well, here's the thing. It's going to depend on what level of prevention you're working at. But I would say regardless of what intervention strategy, specific program or strategy you ultimately use, you need to make sure that it includes these elements. Because these are the things we know both from the social literature and the biological literature that are really important. We know that prevention is important. We know that teaching adolescents about changes of body and the brain. We know emotional regulation is important. We know that problem solving is important. And we know the influence of contextual pressure. My thing is, my work with adolescents, what I find is that most of the time adolescents will probably research more the next phone they're going to buy then they're going to research the next drug they're going to put in their body. But the next drug they're going to put in their bodies can have a heck of a lot more negative effects than the next phone they're going to buy. Okay, so that's why I'm saying whatever intervention or whatever strategy you choose, make sure it includes these principles, because these are the things that we know. The other thing that I want to kind of leave you with as we start to wrap things up, and I'm going to leave you some time for questions, is also think about not only what levels of prevention you're working at, what are the things that you want to cover, which I showed you in the previous slide, but what are the developmental tasks that are related to adolescence? So we know that ages, chronological ages, which is along the left-hand side of this table here, is related to developmental tasks. So things like identity development, which actually cuts across chronological ages, risk-taking, impulsivity, emotional regulation. So maybe intervention areas will include things like emotional regulation, problem-solving, decision-making, which are some of the things I just covered. But what I'm really trying to get you, I'm not going to go through each of these, but what I'm really trying to get you to do here is to think from a principle-based perspective, is that you want to say, what is the level of prevention I'm working at? What are some things I'm going to want to cover? And what are the ages of the adolescents I'm working at? Because we know that there's different developmental stages depending on the adolescents you're working with. So some of your intervention strategies maybe want to target different things depending on where your adolescents are at with that. One of the other things I'm going to leave you with here is also to say that there are resources available. One of the things, especially with vaping, is just increasing awareness and getting information out there. These are some infographics I've taken from the CDC, or Center for Disease Control. These are freely available, and you can access things. CDC is a great source for cigarettes and also e-cigarette information. NIDA, or the National Institute of Drug Abuse, is also another good resource. SAMHSA also has the Evidence-Based Practices Research Center, which focuses on kind of promising practices and evidence-based practices of things you're going to want to try perhaps. But again, really considering what are the levels of prevention you're working at and what are the ages of the adolescents you're working with. Also, if you look at tobacco-based prevention, we've had a lot more opportunity and time to focus on tobacco-based prevention around regular cigarettes than we have e-cigarettes. But they're also, if you Google tobacco-based prevention, you'll find some more interesting toolkits and services out there. Stanford in particular has a tobacco prevention toolkit, which has a whole section focused on e-cigarettes, which is a good one. So again, rather than give you specific programs and so forth, I'm going to ask you to think about what are the levels of prevention you're working with and who are the adolescents that you're working with in terms of what do you want to address, because that's going to be more helpful in helping you target specific products. And the last thing I'm just going to say, did we cover the goal here was to cover the summary or the key questions. What we know is the rates of vaping among adolescents are higher than they ever have been, and they tend to be increasing. Why do adolescents vape? Top 2 reasons why they vape is because of the flavorings. At least when we ask adolescents, the top 2 reasons they vape is because of the flavoring and the people they're hanging out with, whether it be peers or family members that also vape. What are some of the social and biological factors related to vaping? Some of the social factors are that we know that if an adolescent starts vaping earlier, it actually increases their risk for using cigarettes later on and increases their risk for using other substances later on. We also know that some of the biological factors, nicotine in general is just not great for the brain. It could have some negative effects, as well as we know that the chemicals and the aerosols released by e-cigarettes, we don't know the long-term outcomes of those yet, even though we know that they do contain toxins. And the last thing is, how do we prevent adolescent vaping? Well, I talked about before, instead of giving you specific programs and so forth, what I really want you to think about is what level of prevention you're working on, who the adolescents you're working with, but also to realize that if we're going to prevent vaping, we also want to talk about preventing other substances, because a lot of these things go together. It's not just vaping we're working on, but substances are linked together, and how they are linked socially, but also how they're linked biologically with the adolescent brain. Okay, so I'm going to end with that. I'm sorry I kind of sped up during the end, but I just wanted to make sure I covered that information. And I will have a few minutes to take for questions. Okay, I'm just kind of.
Jason,
Yeah.
Someone is asking if there is an evidence-based quit program for youth with vaping.
You know, that's a good question. I haven't really, they're so new in the sense that I haven't found anything yet that I would recommend. And the problem with that is because it really is going to depend on the level of prevention you're working at. So if you're working with adolescents who are quitting, you're probably working with adolescents who are in the yellow part or the red part of the triangle, okay, so to speak. And they're also going to be using other substances as well. And many times what happens is the other substances like marijuana gets targeted as opposed to the vaping, because there's a misperception that the vaping is less harmful, so to speak. So that's what I'll say, just to kind of an easy answer for that.
Jason, the next question is, have you seen adolescents with chemical burns?
Yeah, so that's just one of the common, it comes across like, so one of the negative effects that you'll see in the news media and so forth with adolescents is chemical burns. And part of the reason is because of the devices. As I said, the devices are changing so rapidly. Most of the devices now you charge and they have a rechargeable battery. But not all of them are very stable. So yes, so the chemical burns usually happens in part because of the interaction between heating the liquid, and there's some explosion that's involved. Not unlike kind of, you think about, you've heard batteries from cell phones and other things. So anytime electricity is involved, there's the potential for that.
Jason, the next question. So somebody had mentioned that Montana is working on one through a quit line, a youth-based quit line. So if anybody wants to reach out to Amanda, she might be able to give you more information as to where to locate that.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. And then Mercedes asked, when trying to do prevention, do you think it is effective to tackle multiple substances at the same time? Should we focus on those substances individually?
I think you should tackle multiple things at the same time. And really what you're going to be tackling is there's multiple risks. There's shared risk and protective factors for tackling these things. So even though tobacco-based products tend to be one of the first products that youth use, they're related to other substances. I really think it's about helping youth make better decisions in general than about tackling the substances per se, even though the substances is going to be one of the byproducts. So yeah, I would say because as what we know socially and biologically, these substances probably have more in common than they have different. And the way we go about addressing them is very similar. So yeah, I would think that it was Mercedes who said that. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and then Dana asked, I might have missed this, but would you say that cigarettes are more harmful than vaping?
Yes, absolutely. What we know about cigarettes, they're more harmful than vaping. And just here's a little factoid for you. That's a great question. I don't think I said this during the webinar. Smoking from cigarettes kills more people than all drugs combined. Okay, I know we hear a lot about opiates, and some of the latest numbers are around 70 or 80,000 people, and that's horrible, right? That overdose from opiates. And when you look at alcohol, death from alcohol annually, you're closer to about 90,000. Cigarettes, death from cigarettes is almost 500,000, okay, annually. And that's smoking combustible cigarettes. So death from cigarettes is about 5 times of what other drugs are. So yes, by and large. And one of the things I also pointed out was that even starting with cigarettes doesn't reduce the risk that an adolescent won't then move on to regular cigarettes. It actually increases their risk.
Another question, you talked about the influence of contextual pressure. Are there any good EBP media literacy programs?
There are a lot of them. There are a lot of good ones out there. And what I didn't talk about so much is population-based interventions versus individual-based interventions. So media programs would probably fall what I would consider population-based interventions because you're giving that information to a lot of people. So even the infographics I showed you are kind of population-based interventions, because you're giving media information to large number of people at one time. There are I don't have time to go into them, but I would encourage you to research some of them, but also think about what are some of the research behind them as you do that, and also think about do they contain some of the principles we know from both the social and the biological aspects of what we know about substance use. That's why I'm saying I kind of discourage people from just picking a specific program rather than thinking about what is the context that I'm working in, what are the things I'm trying to address, and really picking a program that meets the needs of the context and the adolescents or the youth that I'm trying to work with. Yeah, and anyway. One of the other questions is, in my opinion, would it be best policy goal prolonging use or flavor? That's a good question. So I don't think, cynical Jason would say, I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where the flavors get banned. I could give you a whole nother lecture on that. Unfortunately, I think what we need to do, in part because vaping is $1 billion business, and so that's kind of what we're working against. And it's a business to make money, unfortunately, and it's making money out of people using these products, just like tobacco has done for decades. So I would say one of the things that we probably should try to do is prolong use, which is, I think what the question is, should we try to delay the onset of use? We absolutely should, and that's, if we can ban flavors as well, I think that'll be helpful, more of an environmental or a population-based strategy. but most of us aren't working at that level. And Rory, I know we're about up on time. I don't know if you want to go through the last 2 slides.
Yes, let's do that. Would you mind?
Sure.
Yeah, so please take some time to either scan the QR code you see on your screen if you have a QR reader on your phone, or to use the link that we've posted in the chat box a couple times to complete the survey. Really important to us. And although this is the last webinar in this particular series, we will be doing others. So if you haven't joined our mailing list, our email list, please do, so that you can be notified about future trainings. And this slide that you see on your screen here, it just tells you how to get to the on-demand webinars that you see there. The website, it's a little hard to navigate the website. So if you click on the Mountain Plains navigation and then under e-learning on-demand webinars, that is where you will find the recordings as well as a PDF of the PowerPoints there. So thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, everybody. Take care.